He'd always been curious about what it would be like to burn alive. To be fastened to a wooden stake atop a platform of dead wood, hands and legs hopelessly bound, unable to escape, unable to do anything except watch as the crowds gathered to see him consumed by fire, curious as to how long it would take for him to scream. He imagined how once the pyre was ignited by flame, the intense heat would likely start him panicking. Inhaling the smoke would make it difficult for him to breathe, of course. But would that start to happen before or after the flesh of his legs and lower body began to blacken and wither? He wondered how much pain he'd have to endure before his body finally succumbed to death's lasting embrace. Would he suffocate in the smell of his own flesh roasting before the flames crawled up his face and into his eyes? His foot accidentally kicked a blackened skull as he walked through the field of ash and charred wood, and it rolled down the rocky embankment, picking up speed, teeth flying in every direction until it shattered like glass upon the cluster of boulders below. The wasteland stretched as far as he could see, a rolling sea of hills and stone, black earth and red sky. Ash fell around him like snow, and the wind carried a sickly burnt and putrid smell that invaded his senses and caught in the back of his throat. He stepped through a withered black wooden archway of what had one time likely been a doorway, but whether leading inside or out, he couldn't tell. Charred wood and scorched debris lay all around him, and every step he took resulted in a crunch of what could have either been timber or bone. In the distance he saw a single tree standing alone in defiance of the fiery carnage around it. As he made for it, he ran his hand through his short hair to brush the ash away, turning his palm smoky grey in color, and he pressed it to his nose and inhaled deeply. When he reached the skeletal dead tree, crooked branches reaching out in every direction like veins under skin, he noticed a young child hanging from her neck by a rope from one of the lower branches. Her chest and stomach were torn open, and her organs lay in a pile on the ground several feet beneath her swinging legs, dead so long even the flies were done with her. As he stared at the girl's remains, he began to feel a sensation at the back of his throat, near his back teeth. An intense coppery flavor, like he had a penny under his tongue. Behind his eyes, a pressure began to build like a migraine combined with a concussion. He pressed his hands to his temples and gritted his teeth against the pain. Suddenly, from within the girl's empty ribcage, a raging fire sprang to life. Flames licked out from between the bones and licked the grey flesh of her arms. He watched in fascination, bordering on revulsion, as the fire seemed to climb like a living thing up her chest, past her neck and into her skull. From her empty eye sockets bloomed two orange blossoms of fiery heat. He expected the fire to engulf her hair and continue up the rope, but the inside of the girl's small body seemed to be containing it like a furnace. He took a step closer to look up inside her ribcage to try to determine what was actually fueling the fire, when the girl's head raised itself ever so slightly, her two burning eyes staring down into his soul like a vengeful god. He choked on his breath and took a hurried few steps backwards, but her eyes remained locked onto him. Slowly, almost painfully, the girl raised her left arm and pointed at him. Her mouth fell open to reveal a red-hot maw of flames. Suddenly, from all around him, blackened figures rose up from the ground. Skeletal remains lifted themselves up from the dirt and ash like puppets on strings. There were dozens of them, behind him, surrounding him, crowding him, grabbing him. Their eyes fire and their hands skeletal black claws. He screamed as one of them took hold of his neck and opened its mouth to shriek an agonizing wail of pain and hatred. An inferno raging in its throat behind its fangs. And suddenly, he awoke. Marcus rolled out of bed covered in sweat and stood up quickly, his instincts telling him to run, even as his brain tried to reassure him it had all been a dream. He put his hand against the wall to steady himself and glanced behind him to look at Karen. She was still in a wine-induced coma and hadn't stirred at all despite his frantic launch out of bed. Her hair was knotted and greasy, and the cast upon her right arm, which hung off the bed, was stained by weak old Merlot. He walked into the bathroom to splash water on his face, but in his dazed and nervous state he turned the wrong faucet and hot water sprayed all over his hands.
"Oh, God damn it,"
he hissed quietly under his breath as he gazed at his reflection in the blemished mirror. A near stranger stared back at him. the bloodshot eyes and sunken cheeks seeming to worsen each day, and his heavy stubble seemed to mock him as it conquered even more of his face. Marcus looked to himself like he belonged on the corner of some intersection holding a cardboard sign standing next to a homeless man with a much nicer cardboard sign. What the hell kind of nightmare had he just had? It had been so surreal, so vivid. It felt less like a dream and more like reliving a moment in time he had long since found a way to repress. It more than unnerved him. It frightened him. There was no way he'd be getting back to sleep tonight. Every time he shut his eyes, he'd see the flaming corpse of that little girl staring down at him in judgment and hatred. He turned off the bathroom light and walked back into the bedroom, and by the glow of the streetlight outside the window, he took in the sight of his life at 35. A second-hand, queen-size bed stuffed awkwardly into the small bedroom of a 3-room apartment. Clothes and trash cluttering the floor. A dusty box television that barely worked, parked on top of a spindly wire rack shelf where unopened mail and neglected bills occupied the lower shelves in no discernible sense of order. By the light from the streetlight that leaked in through the broken and crooked blinds, he could make out cobwebs in every corner of the ceiling. Where centered above the bed was a hanging fan that squeaked when in motion, which was nearly always, as the air conditioning didn't work. And then, of course, there was his wife, Karen. Once the center of his universe, he had returned home from active duty overseas to find that she had lost her job, her money, and the respect of whatever family she had left. She had sunk so deep into a state of depression, most days she couldn't make it until noon before opening another bottle of cheap wine. She'd broken her arm 2 weeks ago after falling through the glass top of their coffee table while trying to uncork a troublesome bottle of cab. They lived together physically, but in their hearts they were thousands of miles apart. Neither of them knew how to make her happy anymore, and he was running out of ideas to try. The other day, during their paltry dinner of scrambled eggs and corn chips, he'd complimented her on her new hair color. She looked at him dully for a few heart-stopping moments before asking emotionlessly,
"Have you ever cheated on me, Marcus?"
No, and I've never been tempted to. Why, have you?
He was still waiting for an answer. Not that it mattered. He knew long before she asked the question, just by the distant look in her eyes. What could he do but accept it and move on and try to salvage what they had left? He sat back down on the bed and stared despondently down at the stained carpeting at the spot between his feet, the dream still prying at his mind like a crowbar pries at a crate. What could it mean? Was it an omen, a metaphor, or just a manifestation of his troubled mind combined with the turmoil of his heart? His cell phone rang from the floor across the room, plugged into charge in the only outlet that worked. His heart leapt in dread and caught in his throat and choked him. There was only one person who'd be calling at this hour. The same person he'd been actively trying to avoid for the past several days. The one person who, after 2 tours overseas, still made him fear the shadows and whatever boogeyman may be lurking within them. Gideon. He crossed the room and picked up the phone. For a second he considered ignoring the call, but immediately decided against it. Gideon knew he was awake. He wouldn't be calling otherwise, and ignoring the call would only make things worse for him. He flipped open his phone. Yes, he was likely the only person left in America without an iPhone, and pressed it to his ear without saying anything.
"Come outside."
Then the call ended. Marcus dropped the phone onto the carpet as he pressed his hand to his face in frustration and fear. Other men may have pulled out their guns or called the cops, but he knew better. Neither would do any good against Gideon. After all, if you happened to find yourself walking across thin ice, you didn't sprint to the shore and hope for the best. You treaded carefully, slowly, taking one cautious step after another, trying as best you can to ignore the sound of the ground giving way beneath you. Gideon was leaning against Marcus's car when he walked outside, arms folded and head bowed, as casual as if he was waiting to pick up his kid from preschool. Marcus had never seen Gideon arrive or leave. He was always just standing there, waiting. If the man drove a car, Marcus had never seen it. Maybe he walked everywhere, even when it was 4 a.m. Gideon looked up as Marcus approached with a blank expression about as easy to read as hieroglyphics. The man was of an indeterminable age, somewhere between 35 and 45. Average height and build, and dressed in a casual suit and leather jacket that wouldn't really seem out of place wherever you were. There was nothing about him that screamed trouble. No intimidating tattoos or horrific scars, or even a chilly mannerism that made you avoid eye contact. Everything about him seemed forgettable and normal. He could be the guy you snap at for taking too long at the ATM, or for holding everyone up by not walking up the escalator. Of course, Marcus highly doubted anyone who snapped at Gideon would ever make it back home to their wives and children afterwards. Marcus had seen him make a biker gang member cry using only a lighter and a corkscrew. Without speaking, Marcus walked up to Gideon and handed him an envelope. Gideon continued staring out across the dark parking lot and reached out and took the envelope without even turning his head towards Marcus.
Is it all there?
His voice was metallic and cold like an ice pick. Marcus didn't hesitate with his reply.
No.
Gideon pocketed the envelope without opening it.
How short is it?
Marcus felt a bead of sweat run down his neck.
2/3.
Gideon finally turned his head and looked Marcus in the eye. There was a moment of silence, and Marcus forced himself not to blink or look away.
I watched a kid die the other night.
His words were emotionless, as if he was commenting on how he watched paint dry.
He was crossing the street while looking at his fucking phone. A cab came driving up, wasn't even speeding, and flipped him right over the roof. The driver paused a moment, then sped off, and the kid died crying in the road as his blood ran down into the storm drain.
Marcus wanted so badly to turn around and run back into his apartment and lock the door, but he knew he was trapped like a man in a subway tunnel. There was no way to outrun the train, so he just had to pray it would stop before it crushed him. Gideon continued.
I could have done something. I could have called an ambulance for the kid. The cops too. I saw the license plate and can describe the driver, but I didn't. Do you know why?
Marcus shook his head.
I hate stupidity. If he didn't have the common sense to look down the road before crossing, why should I lift a finger to save his life? What would have society gained in keeping him alive? Nothing. We benefit more being rid of him.
Gideon turned fully to face Marcus.
Why should I feel obligated to spare those who are too fucking stupid to help themselves?
Marcus swallowed and took a deep, long breath before answering.
Because you can't collect what's yours otherwise.
I'm barely collecting as it is, and I'm starting to think eating the loss will be less aggravating than listening to any more of your excuses.
Marcus felt detached from his surroundings, as if he was watching Gideon through the eyes of another man. It was as if even his conscious mind was trying to separate itself from the situation. He cleared his throat and spoke again.
There's a last resort. Something I've been putting off trying until I absolutely had to.
Tonight was the deadline. Your last resort should have been tried long before now.
I couldn't have done it before tonight. In 48 hours, I'll have the means, the opportunity, and your money.
Gideon's face remained expressionless, but his eyes seemed to burn furious holes through Marcus's face and out the back of his skull.
I don't rely on promises. I express my expectations and provide an incentive.
Gideon opened his coat, and from the lining of his leather jacket he pulled a long strand of barbed wire, which he wrapped nimbly around his gloved hand.
You know what I appreciate about you, Marcus? You stand up straight when you talk to me. Your voice doesn't waver. You don't flinch. It must be the soldier in you. Most people whine and plead and grovel. I can never stand that. It makes me want to cut them that much quicker.
Using the barbed wire fist, Gideon threw a low punch with the force of a cannonball into Marcus's stomach. The wire bit into him like a serpent bite, and the wind rushed out of his lungs, and he was driven to his knees. Gideon threw another punch to Marcus's cheek, and the metal teeth tore past his stubble and drew blood. Marcus fell onto his side, and Gideon planted 2 hard kicks into his gut and groin.
You bought yourself 2 days.
Gideon hissed as he crouched down next to Marcus, like a jackal before its wounded prey.
After that, it's no longer between you and me. I come after Karen too.
At the mention of his wife's name, Marcus felt the pressure he'd experienced in his dreams suddenly start to build behind his eyes, and he was able to taste the copper flavor at the back of his throat again. He started to angrily spit some kind of retort back at Gideon, when the man's barbed wire hand grabbed his shoulder and squeezed like a vice.
Try to run, I'll find you. Try to fight, I'll kill you. Kill yourself, and I'll storm the gates of hell until Satan gives you back to me.
Gideon stood back up and calmly threaded the barbed wire back into his jacket as if he was adjusting his tie. Then he stepped over Marcus and walked across the parking lot into the darkness.
48 hours. Then I find you.
It may have been the fact that his head was pounding, or because his eyes were stinging with sweat and blood, but he could have sworn as he watched Gideon disappear into the shadows, he saw a young girl standing just under the streetlight, her eyes glowing red from the fire ablaze in her skull. By the time dawn broke, Marcus had already cleaned the raw, jagged cuts across his face and stomach with peroxide and bandaged them. He sat outside at the community bench by the apartment complex's mailboxes, one entire cheek covered with blood-stained gauze, and his sunglasses on, patiently watching the new day break. He'd always enjoyed the sunrise. A great ball of fire slowly seemed to spring to life from cold ash somewhere across an infinite horizon. It gave him hope that the risk he was about to take for the sake of himself and his wife would be more than a madman's last stand. Perhaps afterwards they could finally find a way to be happy again. He must have been in the bathroom for at least half an hour cursing loudly as the peroxide stung his torn flesh, but Karen never stirred. Even when he knocked over the change jar on the dresser as he was changing clothes, all she did was roll over and cough, oblivious to the pain he was enduring for them to hopefully secure a better future. As he stared across the parking lot at his neighbors piling into their cars and driving off to work, he was approached by his neighbor Karine as she walked her dog. She was a petite college student with short sandy blonde hair and violet fingernails. Her midriff peeked out just enough under her t-shirt to turn his head. She greeted him cheerily, and then her face immediately fell.
Morning, Marcus. Oh my god, what happened?
She stopped abruptly and her dog was reluctantly forced to halt as the leash went taut.
Hi, Karine. Would you believe I cut myself shaving?
With what, a power sander?
Marcus took off his sunglasses and looked her in the eye.
I had a disagreement with the concrete. I just wanted to be friends. It wanted to give me a good, strong kiss.
Corrine bent down to look closer at it.
Jesus, Marcus. What did Karen say?
When she wakes up, I'll ask her. How's Cosmo?
He asked, nodding towards the small Scottish terrier. She smirked and brushed her hair from her eyes.
Still mine and not the ex's. I'm training him to bite whoever walks into our place wearing skinny jeans. That'll keep the jerk away from us.
That should do the trick, but if it doesn't, you could always call me.
Karine winked and gave him a swift thumbs up as her dog started to tug the leash and coax her along.
You're my failsafe, Marcus. Try not to wreck any more of your face.
Marcus gave her a smirk and a small two-finger salute as he watched her walk down the path. As his eyes lingered on her, he found himself remembering a time when he and Karen used to make fun, small talk like that not so long ago, even though it felt like decades. His phone suddenly buzzed and he flipped it open. His friend Clay started talking without greeting him.
I got your text. Where do you want to meet?
Pick me up at my place. I'll be waiting outside.
He reached under his t-shirt to pat his hidden Glock handgun.
On my way.
Marcus shut the phone and was putting his sunglasses back on when he made eye contact with a figure staring at him across the parking lot. A tall, withered, smoking figure of a man with seared blackened flesh and exposed bone, clothing hanging off of him in tatters, fire erupting out of his neck and engulfing his face. Marcus leapt up from the bench as if he'd been stung by a wasp. His sunglasses and phone fell from his hands and hit the sidewalk. He broke eye contact with the figure for a moment to glance down at his fallen belongings, but when he raised his eyes again, the figure was gone. He frantically spun in every direction, looking for whoever or whatever it had been. But there wasn't any trace of it at all, or even any evidence it had been there to begin with. He looked down the path the way Karine had gone, but she was already out of sight. He sprinted across the lot to the exact spot where the figure had been standing, and placed his hand on the concrete. He withdrew his hand almost at once. Even though the sun had been up for barely an hour, and the temperature hadn't even reached the high 60s yet, the spot on the pavement where the dark stranger had been standing was burning like a hot plate. Marcus didn't say anything to Clay about the dark figure, or the spot on the pavement when he'd arrived in his battered old pickup truck to pick him up. They drove in silence for 20 minutes, without even a comment from Clay about Marcus's bandaged face. He didn't mind not speaking. The image of the flames dancing upwards out of that dark man's neck, and the eyes staring into his soul through the smoke, had shaken Marcus. And it was taking all of his resolve not to show that panic openly in any way his friend would notice. What was going on? Was he hallucinating? Was he sick? Why were those undead creatures he'd seen in his dreams suddenly appearing to him while he was awake? Had he somehow been drugged? He shook his head and forced himself to take several deep, calming breaths. He was likely just overtired and about to meet his threshold before stress and panic crippled him. He forced himself to focus on the task at hand. Whatever he was experiencing, it could wait until after he'd paid off Gideon. Once that looming danger was no longer weighing on his mind, maybe he'd finally be able to think clearly. Clay pulled the truck into the rear parking lot of a liquor store and parked by the back door. The store wouldn't be open for a couple of hours, which was more than enough time for Marcus to lay out the plan to his friends. Clay unlocked the back door, and they both entered into the dark loading dock. Another man was already there, patiently waiting for them, reclining on an ancient sofa in the corner. The man uncrossed his arms from behind his head and stood up as they approached.
I'm putting off a nice hot shower with my fiancée for the sake of this meeting, Marcus. Whatever news it is, it had better be earth-shattering.
Not really, but I thought I'd give your neighbors a chance to sleep in.
The man laughed and walked over to pull Marcus in close for a quick hug.
How's business, Rodney?
Marcus slapped his old friend on the back. Rodney made a sour face.
Man, I should have been a dog groomer. What, no coffee?
Back in high school, Rodney and Marcus had been inseparable best friends and undoubtedly the two most lovable scoundrels who'd ever walked the halls. After graduation, they planned to open their own gym, but they got swept up in life's fast-moving current and Marcus had joined the military, while Rodney had done 2 separate stretches in prison for burglary. Clay was a mutual friend of them both from high school, who in addition to being a private investigator, was co-owner of the liquor store with Rodney.
Who needs coffee? How about a beer instead?
I like how you think. Step into my office.
Rodney ushered them into the walk-in beer cooler off the loading dock. Inside, along the back wall, was a folding table, a leather rolling office chair, and 2 stools. Rodney pulled a Guinness off the shelf and sat down in the rolling chair, propping his legs up on one of the stools as he popped the cap.
One of you is standing. You got me here at the crack of dawn. I'm going to be comfortable.
Marcus remained standing as Clay sat down on the remaining stool. He got right to the point.
I need your help.
How much help? Give us a number.
Clay tore the loose wrapper off of the rim of his bottle of Stella. Marcus took a moment to take a quick look around and examine every corner of the modest-sized cooler.
Are there any cameras in here?
Rodney rolled his eyes.
Only when the ladies have their wet t-shirt contests back here. No, of course there aren't fucking cameras. Now how much money don't you have that bought you that beating?
He pointed his beer bottle at Marcus's bad cheek. Marcus sighed.
45 grand.
Rodney and Clay glanced at each other. Rodney took a long sip from his beer.
I know you're not asking us for that amount, so you must have something else in mind.
There's a safe deposit box I know of. Karen's old boss is in real estate. He keeps thousands of dollars there from flipping houses off the books.
Rodney raised an eyebrow.
How do you know about it?
Because Karen was with him once when he opened the box. He used to buy her gifts when I was deployed.
Clay and Rodney exchanged another doubtful look.
How long has it been since Karen worked for this guy?
Over a year?
So you don't even know if he still uses that box, not to mention how much is actually in it.
Marcus sighed again and ran a hand through his hair. Speaking this plan out loud suddenly made him aware of how reckless it all sounded.
I'm up against a wall. This is the only way out I have left. You know what it was like when I came back from deployment? The weeks of questioning, the discharge, that fucking trial that lasted 5 months. I was 6 feet over my head in debt to attorneys. I had to borrow money from some bad people, and it ruined my life. Karen's too.
Marcus pressed his forehead into the cold wall of the cooler.
I have nothing left. No money, a shit car, barely a home to call my own. No one will hire me. What happened in Baghdad derailed my entire life. I'm just trying to start again. But to do that, I need this loan shark off my back.
Clay and Rodney stared at him in silent judgment, weighing their options carefully in their minds, both of their beers forgotten.
You sure you're not trying to target this guy because he wants to try to buy his way into Karen's pants?
I know how it looks, but I'm too desperate to be jealous right now.
After a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, Rodney finally spoke.
If we do this, we need assurances. This isn't a charity. You get the amount you need, and any extra profit is ours to keep.
One of us watches the crowd, one of us hits the teller windows, the last one hits the box. We're in and out in 2 minutes. I can supply the guns.
But no one gets hurt.
Not if we can help it. I can supply the tools and the getaway car. Keep in mind, this is only because it's you, Marcus. Under any other circumstances, this would not be worth the risk.
Rodney sat up and lowered his feet off the stool.
I know. This is something I'll never ask of you guys again. We have to do it no later than tomorrow.
Marcus's voice was calm, but on the inside, his spirits soared. Clay stood up and stretched.
Point out the bank to me and I'll scope it out today. I have to ask you though, what happens if there isn't enough of a haul to pay your debt?
Marcus shook his head.
Then we're going to need to keep those guns close.
As Marcus walked back across the parking lot with Clay towards the truck, he found himself eyeing all of the shadowy corners within his field of vision where a potential threat could be lurking. He rubbed his eyes and inwardly scolded himself for being so paranoid. As his hand closed around the metal handle of Clay's passenger door, he cursed loudly in pain and shock, and his entire arm recoiled.
What is it?
Clay's hand was immediately on the handle of his own concealed gun under his shirt as his eyes darted everywhere, trying to locate what had made Marcus call out. Marcus was staring at his fingers in astonishment, which quickly turned into dismay as angry red blotches slowly started to appear. The handle of the truck's door had been scalding hot. Marcus looked up at Clay without having the first clue what to say to him. Clay's door was already open, so clearly the handle on his side hadn't scorched him. What was going on? He looked at his reflection in the truck's window, and his heart leapt upwards and caught in his throat. Reflected in the window around him stood 3 burning and blackened people, their mouths wide open, their tongues withered black cords, and the insides of all 3 of their skulls ablaze with a furious roaring inferno. The flames curled upwards between their teeth, out of their ears, and danced around the blackened pits of their eye sockets. Marcus spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance, but he was completely alone on his side of the truck.
What?
Clay demanded with impatience. Marcus slowly shook his head.
Nothing. I caught my finger in your door handle.
The lie rolled off his tongue gracefully, as if he'd been rehearsing it beforehand. Clay rolled his eyes and climbed back into the truck. Marcus felt like his insides were being churned around and diced by a boat propeller. He wasn't just seeing things that time. He'd felt the heat of those things on his back when he looked into their blazing eyes. He took one last panic look around the lot, and even peeked into the bed of the truck just to make sure there weren't more hiding there. Then he tentatively placed his hand again on the door handle, which was unexplainably cool to the touch now, and climbed inside, knowing with an unshakable feeling of certainty and dread that, whatever these things were, they would show themselves again before long. Marcus had Clay drop him off at the center of town before Clay stopped at the bank to examine the layout. As soon as he was out of the truck, Marcus pulled out his cell phone and called Karen. He needed to hear her voice, to calm him, to reassure him that all was right with the world. 3 rings went unanswered before an automated soulless voice informed him that the number he'd called wasn't available. He closed his phone without leaving a message. As he walked down the sidewalk, he avoided looking into any reflective glass around him, be they windshields of cars or shop windows. He tried to find comfort in the normality of the everyday bustle of traffic and pedestrians moving by him without giving him a second glance, and after a few minutes his heart rate slowed and his mind stopped racing. He bought a coffee from a street vendor and sat by the fountain by the traffic circle. He needed to do something that would take his mind off everything, especially the pain in his cheek and fingers. Something that would require his concentration but would keep him calm and help him to kill some time. Then, he had it. The shooting range was only a mile or so up the street. He could head there and blow off some steam for an hour before checking in with Clay again. He stood up to leave and tossed a few coins from his pocket into the fountain without looking back. As the coins hit the water, there was a loud hiss of steam as the small red-hot coin sank to the bottom and seared the padded floor. Just before he entered the range, he tried calling Karen again. There was still no answer. He checked in, had his weapon inspected, and got his safety goggles and earplugs. The guy behind the counter asked if he'd been in a knife fight, indicating the wound on Marcus's face.
Stray cat.
He was already so tired of explaining the bandage, he was tempted just to rip it off. As Marcus set up the paper target in his lane, his cell phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't notice it. His fingers still stung, but not so badly that he couldn't expertly grip his Glock handle, like he had countless times before when he'd been deployed. The rough, shadowy human outline on the paper target seemed to challenge him as he raised his weapon to carefully aim with both hands, easily drowning out the shots of the other couple of people in the range as well. They were miles away in his mind. At this moment, it was just him, the weapon, and his target. He was about to squeeze the trigger when he noticed something appear on the bullseye at the center of the hanging paper sheet. It was a black mark that was steadily growing larger, expanding across the whole bullseye until it completely covered it. Marcus lowered his weapon.
What in the hell?
Suddenly from the center of the charred target, a flame burst into life and engulfed the hanging paper sheet. Marcus ripped off his safety goggles and stared in horror at the flames. He started to call out for help, when from through the fire charged another dark, burning skeletal figure. It wailed like a tortured animal loudly enough to chill Marcus's blood, despite the earplugs. It sprinted directly towards him, moving impossibly fast, its eyes nothing more than smoking pits, and its hands outstretched to grab him with blackened, bony claws. Marcus cried out in terror and fired his weapon wildly, striking the phantom in its forehead, eye socket, and mouth. The skull exploded into fragments which showered flame and ember in every direction, and the body crumbled. But from behind the creature more appeared, seeming to crawl into existence from the hanging target which was still ablaze. 3 more charged him, and he continued to fire, aiming for their heads and knees, trying to drop them as he backed away from the firing station. One of his bullets struck a paper target in another lane, and it too burst into flame, and more burning creatures began to furiously claw their way out of it, as if Marcus had imprisoned them there to burn alive for all eternity, and now they were coming to drag him back to hell with them. Marcus was out of ammo. He ejected the old mag, reloaded a new one in a matter of seconds, and continued firing at the endless assault of burning skeletal men. Each and every one of them was screaming, wailing, roaring, a combination of such horrific sounds, Marcus could barely focus on acquiring targets as the noise seemed to bore itself into his brain and claw at it with dull, jagged nails. By now he had his back pressed against the far wall as the demons were getting close enough to climb over the firing stations. He took one hand off of his gun and frantically felt his way down the range towards the door, not daring to take his eyes off of the creatures. Why wasn't anyone else doing anything? There didn't seem to be anyone else firing at them. No one had even pulled the fire alarm. One of the demons leapt over the barrier and charged at him more like an animal than a human, its burning serpent tongue hanging from the dislocated jaw like a pendulum from a clock. Marcus shot it one-handed between the eyes, and it crumbled into fiery fragments upon the floor. His foot kicked something as he continued to make his way towards the door. It was another handgun, apparently dropped there by someone else. Marcus swiftly reached down and grabbed it, and started screaming back at the charging demons in panic and rage as he fired 2 guns at once as they began to surround him. Some of his shots went wild and struck several more hanging targets, and every time another target was struck, it burst into flame and birthed dozens more raging skeletal monsters. There were too many. He wasn't going to be able to escape. They were all around him, closing in on him. One gun ran out of ammo. He felt the intense pressure build behind his eyes again. The coppery flavor in his mouth returned with such strength, he felt as though he was choking to death on a chunk of the harsh metal. He opened his mouth to scream a final bitter curse, and in that last moment it seemed like all of time slowed to an agonizing crawl. He thought the remaining few bullets discharged from his gun were ablaze like miniature comets flying across space. Even more astonishing, he thought he saw flame erupt from his own mouth, originating from somewhere deep down within his chest. The bandage on his cheek burned and fell away, and from deep within the raw flesh of the cut on his face, flames erupted. Claws were upon him, tearing at his clothes, his skin, his flesh. He screamed as his head was slammed violently down upon the ground under a skeletal foot. He awoke, handcuffed to a bench in the police station. He frantically felt himself all over in panic, checking to see how much of himself was actually left intact. He was shocked to discover no additional burns, cuts, or wounds of any kind. The cut on his cheek had been bandaged again, but otherwise he seemed exactly as he had been before he entered the shooting range. A police sergeant walked over and sat down on a bench across from him, and spoke in a concerned voice.
Glad you're finally awake. We need to have a chat.
Marcus slouched in the passenger seat of Clay's truck all the way back to the liquor store, his hand over his eyes as if trying to prevent the pounding in his temples from spreading through the rest of his exhausted body. He'd spent the day in police custody, being questioned for hours on end. He hadn't said a word about the burning monsters crawling out of the targets like termites out of wood. They would have had him committed. Instead, he said he'd blacked out, exhausted and stressed from lack of sleep, combined with PTSD. The security footage in the room showed him apparently seeming to snap and start firing wildly across the shooting range at multiple targets. The other people at the range had dropped their own weapons and quickly exited. Marcus fired almost non-stop for 4 minutes, his eyes darting everywhere, acting like he was being surrounded by enemies on all sides, until he'd seemed to finally collapse from exhaustion. Clay had come to pick him up. Given his military record, in addition to the fact he hadn't deliberately fired his weapon at anyone, he wasn't being charged with reckless endangerment. But his weapon had been confiscated, and he was forbidden to handle a firearm again until completing a thorough psych evaluation. On the one hand, Marcus considered himself very lucky that he hadn't hurt anyone, in addition to the fact that none of the other people at the range had decided just to drop him with their own weapons in self-defense. On the other hand, well, enraged, fiery skeleton monsters. Could what was happening to him really be as simple as PTSD? He'd never heard of a situation quite like this, where instead of losing yourself in time and recalling horrific flashbacks of combat, you were being attacked in real time by hallucinations of the undead. Marcus's cell phone battery had died during his time at the police station. He tried calling Karen on Clay's phone, but she still didn't answer. Perhaps because she didn't recognize the number, or perhaps because she was already drunk. They pulled into the liquor store parking lot, and they both exited the truck and made their way inside through the back way as they had before. The store was still open, but by walking through the loading dock and directly into the beer cooler, they avoided being seen by any of the employees or customers. Rodney was waiting for them, arms crossed, leaning against the folding table when they walked in. His greeting was chilling.
What in the name of Judas fucking Iscariot happened?
Marcus tried to reach deep down within himself to find a satisfying answer that would sound at least somewhat plausible, but there was nothing left to draw from. He gave a pitiful shake of his head and sat down on the stool, while the other two stood over him. Rodney's impatient eyes bore into Marcus like icy talons.
What in the hell is wrong with you, Marcus? Are you sick or something? Why are you shooting up a firing range less than an hour after we established our plan with you?
Marcus stared back at them hopelessly.
I'm sorry. I panicked and blacked out. I thought I was okay, but my PTSD is clearly worse than I thought it was.
Rodney stared down at him without speaking for a moment.
Are you bullshitting me?
Unfortunately not.
Rodney threw his hands up in the air.
I'm your oldest friend, Marcus. I can tell when you're bullshitting me. What aren't you telling me?
Marcus could only stare solemnly back at him, meeting his eye but unable to find the words to explain to his old friend what he was experiencing.
Are you setting us up? Is that fucking loan shark strong-arming you into getting us pinched?
Marcus replied almost too quickly.
No, he doesn't know anything about the plan.
There is no fucking plan, Marcus. Not anymore.
Marcus felt as though everything inside him had died.
What do you mean? What happened?
Clay rubbed his chin uncomfortably.
I tried to call you after I scoped out the bank. There are 4 security guards and an iron cage between anyone entering that bank and the safety deposit boxes.
That's more than a 3-man job. That's at least a 5-man job. And before we could even begin to consider 2 more guys on short notice, you let your trigger finger ejaculate all over the place.
We can't have you involved, Marcus. You're a loose cannon.
Clay looked legitimately disappointed. Rodney acted as if he was the one who was losing everything. He was fuming, running his hands through his hair with agitation.
Without even knowing for sure how much money is even in that box, we're not going to risk bringing in any more guys.
Marcus felt rage start to boil deep down within himself. Partially at them, partially at Gideon, but mostly at himself.
Guys, please, I need this money. Karen and I are dead if I can't deliver.
Rodney's voice was unwavering and stone cold.
We'll take you wherever you need to go to hide, but this bank job isn't happening.
Marcus raised his voice for the first time.
That's not good enough! He'll find us and cut us to pieces while we're alive, just to record our screams so we can listen to them later.
Rodney rolled his eyes.
Don't be ridiculous. He's only one man. We'll think of something and you'll both be fine.
Marcus almost laughed in crazed panic.
You think you're safe? By now, he knows I've been speaking with you two. Once he's done with me, he'll come for you. You're both as dead as I am.
Rodney backhanded Marcus across the face and sent him toppling backwards off the stool.
Get a fucking grip, and don't even pretend to threaten me. Who in the hell do you think you're talking to?
Marcus felt the fury crash down upon him like the ocean tide. The pressure behind his eyes felt like hot needles. From the back of his throat came the now familiar burning sensation. Rodney leaned down to extend his hand and help Marcus back up. Marcus shakily took Rodney's outstretched hand and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. It only took half a second to pull Rodney's gun out from his holster with his other hand. Before Rodney even knew what had happened, Marcus fired a shot directly through Rodney's teeth and out the back of his head. He spun and pointed the gun at Clay's head, who managed to choke out a desperate, pitiful,
"Wait!"
before Marcus painted the cooler wall with a man's brain. The bullet shattered several bottles of beer, and fragments of glass and foamy booze ran down the walls, mingling with the blood, and started to collect in pools around the bodies of the two fallen men. Marcus felt his body move on autopilot. He put the gun in Clay's limp outstretched hand and sprinted out of the cooler, across the loading dock and into the street beyond. He wasn't tied to the stake. He was impaled upon it, the wooden spear crammed upwards between his lower ribs sticking out at the top of his left shoulder, grazing his ear. The pain was so overwhelming he could barely hold a thought in his head. But what he could faintly discern in the fraction seconds of clarity was blackened earth, red sky, falling ash, and the pyre he was mounted upon surrounded by withered, undead people. They were chanting together in perfect unison, their voices filled with fervor and rage.
"Burn it, man! Burn it, man! Burn it, man!"
Their voices grew louder, the crackling of the flames within their skeletal ribcages escaping through their open, chanting mouths. Marcus tried to beg for mercy, but his tongue was gone and only wet, bubbling blood escaped from between his cracked lips. As one of the undead horde opened their mouths wide and blew fire upon the wooden pyre beneath him, his body was almost immediately engulfed in raging flame. He wailed as the flesh melted off his bones and the flames crawled upwards, invading his senses, choking his breath and forcing their way down his throat and into his eyes. Marcus was jolted awake with a start. He was drenched in sweat. He rolled over and discovered, with mild surprise, he was curled up inside an abandoned car under an overpass. Kicking open the door, he found that it was dawn. He was sore and famished and reeked of sweat and smoke. Why did he smell like smoke? He had no memory whatsoever of what had happened after he'd left Clay and Rodney's bodies in the cooler. Was it safe to go home? Probably not. But he knew of somewhere close to it he could go instead. Marcus carefully looked around his parking lot for a full 10 minutes before deciding the coast was clear. He jogged across the lot, keeping out of the line of sight from the windows of his own apartment, and knocked on another door. Karine opened it, coffee cup in hand and Cosmo by her feet, both of them about ready for the morning jog.
Marcus! Oh my god, what happened?
Marcus spoke nervously, barely above a whisper.
May I come in, please?
Karine hesitated a moment, then opened the door wider and let him step inside.
Did something happen to Karen? There were police cars over by her place last night.
Marcus sank into her couch and buried his face in his hands.
No. I haven't spoken with Karen since the day before yesterday.
Karine sat down on the futon next to him and leaned forward.
You smell like smoke, Marcus. What happened? Does it have anything to do with the fire at the liquor store?
Marcus's head shot up.
What fire?
Don't ask me how, but a fire started in the beer cooler. At least 2 people were inside it.
Marcus stared past her concerned face and into the empty space beyond her. He couldn't be here. He was dangerous, and he didn't want to hurt any more people.
I'm sorry I came here. I should go.
He started to stand up quickly. Karine moved faster, and she shoved him back down.
You look like you just saw a ghost rape your mother. What is going on?
Rodney and Clay are dead. I saw them die.
Oh my god, Marcus. Who did it? Should I call the cops?
Suddenly, Marcus couldn't hold back anything anymore. The weight of everything was too much of a burden to bear, and the words came pouring out of him like a storm from the clouds.
You remember I spent 2 years in Baghdad, right?
I remember, yeah. You spent both your tours there.
Marcus suddenly found himself holding her hand.
On my second tour over there, this guy in a suit walks into our tent and said he needed us for a matter of national security. He said it was classified, and any mention of it after the fact would result in our being discharged and tried in criminal court. There was some Taliban gun for hire, the kind of guy who cuts you open and fills you with starving rats instead of just beheading you. He was taking refuge in a green zone, a non-combat area, and it was suspected he was being sheltered by one of our own.
Karine nodded without interrupting, her eyes glued to him, his hand firmly in hers.
The suit showed us pictures. He had killed children, cut out their insides while they were still alive, just to send a message to the Americans what he was capable of doing. Our mission was to eliminate him at all costs. No waiting for permission from Washington. No rules of engagement, strings attached. Find him and kill him by any means necessary. And if that meant tossing a grenade into a room filled with civilians, we had prearranged weapons-free tactics cleared.
Marcus paused as the memories came flooding back to him. He could hear the gunfire all around him again, as if he was back there, engaging the enemy all over again, like the first run had been a dress rehearsal. There had been 4 of them, Lowry, Spence, Tank, and himself. They'd been searching the compound in secret for a couple days, dressed in camos instead of tactical gear to keep a low profile. Eliminating all the obvious spots around the perimeter, a fugitive could both hide and easily escape from. On the 3rd day, Spence had discovered blueprints revealing that in a second-floor office of a 4-story hospital building, there was a panic room that was worth checking out. The office was listed as unoccupied, and therefore the room should have been designated inoperable. But upon discovering the room was sealed from the inside, they decided to stand down for a time and wait the occupant out. Tank had sat by the emergency stairway. Marcus had watched the elevator, and Larry and Spence had watched the room itself from their position across the hall. After several hours with no activity and dusk starting to fall, they were prepared to try to breach the door when 2 men dressed as Iraqi translators had entered the room with automatic weapons and pounded on the door. Their Taliban assassin walked right out past the window and into the light of the dying sun, and right into the arms of his protectors. Larry and Spence could have immediately opened fire and caught them off guard. They'd been under orders to shoot on sight, but it was a building full of sick and wounded people, and they didn't want to engage in a firefight unless absolutely necessary. They ordered the 3 men to stand down, but the assassin fled and his men drew their fire. Lowry was shot through the cheek and had his jaw blown off. Spence killed one of the traitors before a grenade blew up under him. Marcus had encountered the 2nd traitor by the elevator and had exchanged shots, taking 2 of his own in the thigh and shoulder before dropping the man with a round through the neck. By the time he reached Tank by the stairs, the Taliban assassin had overpowered him and had force-fed Tank his own knife. Marcus shot him in the arm, but the assassin picked up Tank's shotgun and had fired 3 deafening rounds at Marcus, grazing him in the lower back and left side. The man had escaped back into the panic room while Marcus lay there bleeding on the carpet. The alarms blaring but no one evacuating the building from the floors above because they were too afraid of being caught in the gunfire. Marcus had crawled down the stairs and out into the street, leaving a trail of blood behind him and praying he wouldn't die, just so he could see his wife again. Back in Karine's living room, Marcus recorded it all in stunning, vivid clarity. His hands shook and his voice trembled, and it felt like the whole room was spinning around him. He paused and shut his eyes, forcing himself to take 3 long breaths before continuing.
We hadn't anticipated him having friends. Those 2 agents looking out for him, disguised as translators, caught us off guard. My guys all died. I was bleeding out. I was waiting for him to come back and finish me. I panicked.
Marcus released himself from Karine's warm grip and buried his face in his hands.
I burned the place down. It was a 4-story building. There were over 60 people trapped in the floors above. I lost my mind. In some sick and illogical way, I thought any one of them could be more of his agents. I just wanted to survive. I wanted to get back home to my wife. I just ignored the screams and watched the whole thing burn against the night sky. Then the fucker threw a small girl out the window with a rope around her neck, just to spite me. I can still see her hanging there, the smoke billowing around her.
Marcus's tears were seeping into his cut face, and the salty moisture was setting the wound ablaze with fresh pain. Karine stared deeply into his eyes, her words caught in her throat, somewhere between shock and sympathy.
Did you get him?
Does it matter?
They were both quiet for several heartbeats.
I was discharged immediately, sent home, and was tried for manslaughter. The suit who had hired us vanished without a trace. I didn't have his name or a rank or anything. To the world around me, I was just some unhinged war criminal. I sank myself hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt, hiring legal teams to exonerate me of blame and rule it as an accident. I've been trying to buy back my soul ever since. And you know what the bitter irony was? When I got back, Karen was sleeping with her boss. She blames me for ruining her life.
Karine wiped the start of a tear out of her own eye.
Who else knows about this, Marcus?
Marcus shook his head despondently.
About a dozen lawyers or so. They think I made up most of it. The families of all my team who died know some of it and hate my guts. Karen doesn't even know the whole story.
What are you going to do now?
I don't know, Karine. Part of me wants to turn myself in. Another part of me wants to run. But either way, I won't be safe, and neither will Karen. Not unless Gideon gets the rest of his money.
Who's Gideon?
Marcus managed a sick chuckle.
This guy who killed the boogeyman and now wears his skin. All I have left is Karen. She's the reason I did all of this. And now that fucking drunken wreck of a bitch won't even acknowledge I'm in the room unless I block the TV.
Karine leaned forward and kissed him lightly on the forehead.
She's not all you have, Marcus.
Marcus let her put her arms around him and give him a long, loving hug. Marcus watched as Karine waved to him as she backed her car out of the parking space and drove off, Cosmo bouncing around in the passenger seat, eager to be going for a long ride. Now that he'd told her the truth, Karine wasn't safe from Gideon, at least for the time being. If he couldn't find Marcus right away, he may use her to get him, and Marcus couldn't handle the weight of another innocent soul on his conscience. He told her to leave for several days until he contacted her, and if he didn't, just to keep driving until she found a safe cluster of stars to camp under. Well, she seemed to relish the idea of a road trip. Marcus went back into Karine's place, showered and borrowed some of her ex's clothes that were still hanging around. Black cargo pants, a stained grey t-shirt with a blood-coloured coiled snake on it, and a leather jacket. He angrily tore the bandage off of his face and let the jagged cut breathe, exposed in all of its horror to the world around him. His own personal mark of shame. Then he left the apartment and crossed the parking lot. Across the lot by the mailboxes stood another one of the burning, undead figures, but Marcus just stared it down for a few moments before turning his head to ignore it. He unlocked the door and walked in. Karen was sprawled out on the couch in one of his t-shirts, the TV blaring some DVR-recorded reality show and an open bottle of wine at her feet. The broken coffee table she'd fallen through was still in the middle of the room, and some of the glass shards were still sprinkled across the rug. Karen barely turned to look him in the eye.
Where the hell have you been? The cops were here last night asking questions about you. Did you go crazy and shoot someplace up?
She was tripping over her words. She was somewhere between very hungover and newly drunk. Marcus got between her and the TV and stared directly into her eyes.
Why did you do it, babe?
Do what? Move out of the way.
Why did you cheat on me? We were good together. You said we were happy.
I was happy when you were around, Marcus. When you weren't, I was nothing. I was alone and meaningless.
You were never meaningless to me.
Marcus tried to take her hand, but she snatched it away and glared at him.
Then why couldn't you give me a baby? I wanted someone to be here when you weren't, Marcus. I wanted to raise your kid, but no, you couldn't do it.
Marcus sighed and hung his head.
I'm sorry we couldn't get pregnant.
Yes, I know you are, Marcus. You've only said it 70 fucking times. Always saying we couldn't, as if the failure was somehow on me as well. I was even willing to adopt, or try the artificial way, but there was never any way we were going to be able to afford that, thanks to you.
Marcus felt the rage returning.
I was drowning in legal fees. We couldn't afford food. I would have done it if I could. You know that.
Karen took a long sip from her wine glass, and Marcus snatched it away, spilling wine all over the rug.
It's 8 a.m. All you do is drink and sleep. You can't even answer your phone when I call.
That's because we're done, Marcus. There's nothing left between us anymore to save. I see you flirting with that slut with the dog across the lot. Go romance her. Maybe the stink of failure makes her hot. Or maybe it's the stink of bodies burning.
Don't you dare! Don't you fucking dare!
He suddenly felt sick to his stomach as the reality set in that, if they were done, he might as well have died in Baghdad, and all those people had burned for nothing. His hands clenched into fists hard enough for his nails to cut his palms. The wine bottle by his feet tipped over, spilling the rest of its contents across the rug, but there was a soft ting of glass on glass that caught his attention. Looking down, he saw the wine bottle had made contact with an empty, discarded beer bottle. Karen didn't drink beer, and the brand of beer wasn't the kind he ever drank. Karen saw him see it, and the guilt in her eyes was more obvious than blood on a murder weapon. Marcus grabbed her bad arm in the cast and squeezed it, pressing the weight of his body against her healing fracture.
You lying, drunken, cancerous whore! I sacrificed everything for you while you were out mounting other men. It ruined my life. Who was just here, huh? Who did I just miss?
A voice came from behind him.
You didn't miss anyone!
From out of the bathroom charged another man Marcus didn't recognize. He tackled him and slammed him down hard into the floor. Karen screamed at them both as the stranger pummeled Marcus with numerous blows to the face and chest. The wound on Marcus's cheek tore open and blood flowed freely from it again. Marcus blindly groped around him for something to defend himself with. His hand found a shard of broken glass from the broken coffee table, and he jabbed it upwards directly into his attacker's eye. The man screamed and threw himself back. Karen wailed and crawled to him, frantically screaming for Marcus to call an ambulance. Marcus was back on his feet, blood pouring from his cheek and broken nose. The pressure behind his eyes and coppery flavor in his throat was back, but this time, they didn't seem quite so unpleasant. From outside every window, peering in at them, were several undead people, staring at him with burning eyes.
Burning man! Burning man! Burning man!
Marcus pointed down at his wife, indicating her to the gathered figures outside.
It was all because of her. She's all yours.
Karen looked at him in confusion as the cast on her arm suddenly burst into flame. She screamed in terror and pain and tried senselessly to beat it out against her wounded lover's chest, which set him ablaze as well. The window shattered inwards as the burning figures crawled in like animals. Their blackened claws gouging holes in the walls and floors. Everything they made contact with erupted into flame. Karen shrieked as she was swarmed by dozens of them. They tore her to pieces as fire engulfed the room. Marcus laughed as he slouched down against the wall to watch the failure that was his life burn before his eyes. Marcus awoke a day later in the burn ward of the hospital. By the time firefighters had pulled him from the flames, most of his body had been ravaged by third-degree burns. He was propped up in bed with bandages covering his face, positioned where he could look out the window and watch the sunrise. How had he survived that? The flames had been licking the walls in a matter of seconds. There was no way the firefighters could have arrived in time to save his life. Why had he been spared? The door to his room shut, and he heard footsteps cross the room. They weren't the rushed or efficient footsteps of a nurse busy making their rounds. These were slow, contemplative steps, as if someone was taking in the sight for the first time. There was a moment of silence as Marcus waited, unable to turn his head.
I really do admire you.
Marcus immediately recognized the voice. The figure leaned in close to Marcus's face. It was Gideon.
You weren't about to let me take anything away from you, so you decided to set it all ablaze and leave me with nothing.
He spoke calmly, never breaking eye contact with Marcus as he removed a syringe from his pocket.
You killed your wife, killed your best friends. Hell, you even killed your wife's lover as a bonus. But astonishingly, you failed to die yourself.
Gideon squirted the faintest trace of black liquid out of the end of the needle.
It looks like your eyes survived the fire. I think I'll take those from you, Marcus. But before I do, I want to show you something.
Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph of Karine pumping gas into her car. Cosmo was in the front seat, and she was wearing the same outfit she had on when Marcus had last seen her.
I know she's not technically involved in our business, but I'm disgruntled that I don't have anyone to beat my money out of anymore. I guess she'll have to do. I wanted you to live with that knowledge before I blind you and leave you paralyzed for life.
As Gideon bent down to jam the syringe into Marcus's eye, Marcus began to laugh through the bandages. Gideon paused. At first it was just a chuckle, but after a moment it turned into a roar of absolute satisfaction and glee. Gideon took a step back and looked at Marcus in irritation and confusion.
Have you already lost your mind? If so, that really disappoints me.
Suddenly the laughing stopped, and at the same moment Gideon dropped the needle to the floor as his hands flew up to clutch at his face. Gideon screamed in blood-curdling agony as his eyes melted from under his eyelids and flame erupted from out of his mouth. Smoke leaked from his nose and ears as the inside of his head burned. The man collapsed onto the hospital floor, his clothes beginning to smoke, flames reaching upwards out of his eye sockets. Marcus stood and flung off the blankets. As he walked across the room to the bathroom, the flowers resting on the bedside table caught fire. Inside the bathroom, he shrugged his shoulders and cracked his neck, and the bandages and hospital robe burned right off to fall upon the floor as withering black shreds of cloth. His hair was gone, but his eyes were clear and bright and full of life, burning like red embers. His skin was already healing nicely, the scars and burns fading away into the rough stubble he'd sported before. Outside, the fire alarm was wailing and the emergency sprinklers had kicked on. Marcus ignored the water and opened his mouth wide, spotting a flame burning fiercely at the back of his throat. He laughed as he stepped out of the bathroom and threw the tattered remains of his smoky leather jacket and scorched t-shirt with the blood-red cobra. On the ground, the undead burning skeletal man tore at Gideon's body, devouring it in flame.
Good work, boys. Let's hit the town and paint it red.
He opened the door and stepped out into the hall, water falling from the sprinklers but doing nothing to douse the fire within him. The undead followed him, chanting as they went.
Burning man! Burning man! Burning man! I have done terrible things. I am haunted by the regret it brings. I've set the flames across the lands.